Sylvia ran fast, barefoot through the hot sun that scalded her feet, sweating profusely and heaving badly, barely breathing while carrying a man, who was heavily injured, on her back. It was a man who had just been injured in the accident that had just happened a few minutes ago, and he knew she had to get him to the hospital as soon as possible. Please subscribe, like, and comment for more fresh stories.
The street was still buzzing with the leftover chaos of morning traffic, with hawkers shouting prices, workers hurrying to work, and impatient horns blaring from taxis. One of those hurrying to get to work was Sylvia, who was crossing the busy road in Kedu, while walking as fast as she could. She had adjusted the strap of her worn-out handbag and turned onto a side street she always took to save a few minutes' walk when a thunderous crash erupted behind her, followed by metal screeching, glass shattering, and a sickening thud that silenced everything else, which made her heart drop. She turned her head immediately, like many others who were also close to the direction of the sound, and what she saw caused cold shivers to run down her spine, and caused her to freeze. "Please help me," the man, who had just been hit by a bike, begged, as he remained sprawled to the floor. In just a few seconds, passers-by who had just witnessed the scene gathered around watching the man helplessly as he begged. None moved a hint as they looked at him like an amusement, while some took pictures and videos of the scene. "Jesus, see blood," someone whispered. Another shook his head. "This one don't go." Scared at first, Sylvia froze in her spot, watching as the man struggled while others watched. Feeling the strange nudge in her heart and knowing that she could not leave him there, she shakily stepped forward. "Please let us help him. Someone should look for a cab," she pleaded with the crowd as she squatted beside him, but no one moved. She screamed at the top of her voice, begging, but no one flinched. Sensing the impending danger as the clock ticked by each second, with no one eager to move or help, she did the unthinkable, even if she was scared. She bent down, heaved his arm over her shoulders, and somehow, driven by desperation, managed to get him on her back, causing the crowd to gasp. With every ounce of strength in Sylvia, she began to run as fast as he could to the nearest hospital that she knew was just a few minutes away, blood dripping her body. Sweat poured down her face as she staggered through the dusty street toward the nearest hospital as her legs burned, and her lungs screamed for air, but she didn't stop, hoping he would not die. The nurses at the front desk barely looked up when she burst in and dropped him. "He's dying," Sylvia cried, panting, "Please, help him. He was in an accident." The first nurse frowned as she asked, "Do you have any deposit?" "We need a deposit before any kind of treatment." Sylvia stared, disbelief spreading across her face. "He's bleeding. He's dying right there," she begged. The nurse shrugged helplessly. "That's the rule," she said. Tears filled her eyes as she opened her small purse and saw that a few crumpled notes were all she had left. She thought of her unpaid rent and the empty food tin at home. She almost turned to leave, but then thought of the man who was pale, and barely breathing couldn't let her walk away. "Take it," she whispered, pushing the money toward the counter. "Just start something, please." Later, after they administered first aid, a nurse came outside to tell her what was going on, that the man had several rib fractures, broken bones in his arm and legs, and a slight concussion. When she was told the bill needed to proceed with further treatment after they stopped the bleeding, Sylvia's heart dropped because she knew that there was no way she could get that kind of money. It was almost her 6 months' salary combined, and she barely had savings. "You have to make further payments if you want to save him," the nurse told her further, and she sat down, devastated. There was no way she would even have money to begin real treatment. And more than anything, she needed money too. 20 minutes later, after sitting around, praying someone would call the man's locked phone, which was luckily in the pocket of the clothes he was wearing, it rang, and she hurriedly informed the caller of the situation, her voice shaking. Barely 10 minutes had passed, when the sound of engines roared outside, and a convoy of black SUVs drove into the compound as men in suits rushed out, followed by a woman whose beauty seemed to silence even the nurses. She was a tall, elegant woman in her late 40s with skin that glowed, and her hair fell in perfect waves down her back, the scent of her perfume filling the corridor even before she spoke. She was dressed in a stunning, white, expensive dress and wore diamond necklaces, her heels clicking on the floor as she stormed inside. It was the man's wife. "Where's my husband? Where is the man that was brought in?" "Fadik," the woman demanded, and they wondered whom she was talking about. When the nurses hesitated, she screamed, "Why are you all standing? Do something." At her command, the hospital came alive as nurses scurried, and doctors ran stretchers. Within minutes, the man, whose name was Chief Ajibade, was wheeled into surgery. Sylvia stood aside, small and invisible, her breath shallow, and her heart still trying to make sense of what was going on. Nobody asked who she was because they were all busy running around, confused. Realizing she was late for work, she quietly turned and left, her slippers dragging in the dust once again. By the time she reached the food stall where she worked, the sun was already high in the sky, and her boss, Mama G, a short, fat woman, was waiting outside already with a frown. "Sylvia! Look at the time," she shouted angrily. "I'm sorry, Ma," she tried to explain, but a hot slap landed across her cheek before she even finished speaking. "Don't give me stories. You'll lose today's pay," Mama G promised her, as she clutched her hot cheeks, almost crying. The pain burned deep, and Sylvia, who was looking so haggard, rough, and tired already, thought to herself that perhaps goodness was useless, and that maybe helping had only cost her more than she could afford. All day she worked in silence, with her eyes stinging with tears, and her hands trembling. But that night, after she closed from work and walked past the street where the hospital was, something in her refused to let her go home without checking on the man from earlier. She slipped through the corridors of the hospital quietly and asked if the man from the morning chaos had survived the surgery. Then one of the nurses told her, "Chief said if you come again, they should bring you straight to him. He has been looking around for you, and the reason why he has not transferred hospital yet." Sylvia hesitated at the door for a moment before going into the ward they said he was in, and when she entered, she saw Chief Ajibade sitting up. He looked so much better now, like he had not been in danger earlier that morning, but his face and arm were still bandaged. When he saw her, he smiled. "You are the young woman who carried me here, right?" he said gently. "Yes, sir," Sylvia answered with almost a whisper. And she soon learned that he was not just anyone, but one of the wealthy men in the city, the owner of a top company. He told her to sit and appreciated her so much with gladness in his heart. He was so grateful to her and told her she saved his arm from being amputated by bringing him in fast. Then, in the calmest tone, he asked what she wanted most in life and that he would grant her anything. The question stunned Sylvia, and for a long moment, she could not speak. She had never been asked what she wanted in her life because she was an orphan who had nobody. Finally, she told him that she had no stable job and nowhere truly to call home. She slept in cramped, grouped rooms where they paid to sleep daily and only at night, where mosquitoes would feed mercilessly on them. It was hell. Within a week, he arranged everything. He gave her an apartment in one of his unused houses, which was a modest but beautiful two-bedroom bungalow in a beautiful neighborhood, and Sylvia could not believe her ears when he gave her keys, saying it was hers. The first night she slept there, she didn't even turn on the lights for a long while. She just sat on the floor and wept, overwhelmed by gratitude, her heart whispering prayers into the still air. Then he got her a job in his company, Ajibade Holdings. She became his secretary since she had not completed her education and didn't have the relevant qualifications that other job positions required. At first, Sylvia was shy and nervous because the company was full of well-dressed ladies and men who spoke fluent English and looked like they were coming for fashion shows every day. But she told herself that she would learn and show that she deserved the position, even when she heard whispers about her every time about how poor, cheap, and lowlife she looked. She would arrive early at her office, which was just before Chief's own every day, take notes on everything, make Chief's schedules perfect, and work harder than anyone. She made mistakes at first, but she learned fast, and in 6 months, her salary had increased. And in just a year, it had quadrupled what she earned in her first month. Soon, some people began to talk, saying that she was Chief's mistress, and that no ordinary secretary could rise so quickly without sleeping her way to the top. But Silver had long learned that dignity is not defended with words and just continued to work harder. The more she worked, the more Chief Ajibada was impressed with her intellect and sharp insights. She would offer small suggestions to him whenever she saw that he was in a pickle about something that turned out to save the company money, yield big results, or win new big clients with the most brilliant ideas. He began to rely on her, not just as a secretary, but as a trusted hand. He wanted her to rise to a better position. "You should finish your studies, Sylvia. I will sponsor you," he told her one afternoon. "You are too intelligent for the mere job of a secretary," he told her. Tears filled Sylvia's eyes when he said it, and she could not believe that he would be so good to her. She thanked him profusely, her mind still reeling in the shock and disbelief, but he told her that she deserved it in every way and even better. However, something happened. It began with whispers in the corridors, and it spread quickly that Chief Ajibada had fallen gravely ill after he had missed coming to the company for a week. The news hit the company like a tremor, and many meetings got cancelled, as well as appointments that required his presence for about 3 weeks. Barely a month later, an announcement came that Chief's only son, the one no one had ever seen, the one who had been abroad for years, was returning to take over the company. His name was Charles Ajibada. Rumor had it that he was a man of few words, brilliant but cold, educated in the finest schools overseas, and known for his ruthless efficiency. Information also reached them that he was planning a full company mop-up, which had everyone scared. Some staff also whispered so that Sylvia would hear, while saying that he would not tolerate the sentimental decisions of his father, especially not a secretary without a degree sitting close to the top. The morning the news was confirmed, Sylvia felt the weight of it settle in her chest, and her heart began to race. In the quiet of her small office, she sat staring at the computer screen, her fingers trembling over the keyboard as the fear of losing everything she had built from scratch overwhelmed her. A few days later, on Monday, Sylvia was arranging her files and making sure everything was in order before the new boss arrived. Everyone in the building was tense that day, and whispers filled the hallways, with people adjusting ties, checking their makeup, and pretending to look busy. The moment Charles Ajibade walked in, the entire office seemed to pause. He was tall, broad-shouldered, good-looking, and carried himself with so much grace and sophistication. His skin was smooth, he smelled so enchanting, and his custom-made suit looked so good on him. Everything about him screamed class as he sauntered past everyone, who just continued staring as he made his way into the elevator that led to his new office. Sylvia was seated in her usual position, arranging some documents, when she heard the sound of shoes approaching and a wave of sweet cologne washing her senses. She lifted her head and froze. For a second, she forgot to breathe. The man who stepped in looked like he had just walked out of a magazine. He had a sharp jawline, smooth skin, piercing eyes that seemed to see everything. He was easily one of the most attractive men she had ever seen in her life, and if not the most. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and it was as if time paused as she rose to her feet. Then his expression changed instantly to a cold and unreadable one. "You are?" he asked flatly. "I'm Sylvia, sir. Chief's secretary." He stared at her for a few seconds longer and then looked down at the files on her desk. "So you're the one," he muttered under his breath. Sylvia frowned slightly and asked. "The one what, sir?" "The one always hanging around my father," he said, still not looking up. Then, calmly, he added, "Your services are no longer needed." She blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "You can pack your things," Charles said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I don't feel comfortable working with you." Something in her snapped. Maybe it was the way he said it, like she was a nobody, which made her speak back. She told him she didn't think it was fair to fire her without even knowing her work, without giving her a chance to prove herself. Her voice shook a little, but her words came out clearly. She asked him to let her work for a month, and if he still wasn't satisfied, she would leave without question. Her confidence caught him off guard because he wasn't used to being challenged, especially in a way so calm and respectful. Still, he made a small, cutting remark, suggesting she should stay in her lane, as if she was trying to seduce him, and Sylvia looked him straight in the eyes and replied that he wasn't her type, and never would be. Then she went back to her desk. The first few weeks after Charles Agba took over the company were the hardest for the employees of Agba Holdings. He changed almost everything in the company and brought new policies, schedules, and expectations. He was strict, and everything about him carried authority that left no room for comfort as he cut down budgets that had stood untouched for years and gave teams deadlines to come up with a new vision for the third quarter of the year. People called him ruthless behind his back, but never dared to say it out loud. Sylvia also worked hard, determined not to give him any reason to fire her, by working quietly, arriving early, leaving late, and avoiding every kind of attention, but no matter how hard she worked, he always found something small to complain about. This report is too long. These minutes should be shorter. You should have anticipated that meeting, Sylvia. Still, she did not talk back and simply nodded, even though it burned inside her. At home, Charles's mother, Fa de Cou, who was never comfortable that Chief kept her close just because she saved his life, often asked if he had fired that woman. She still believed Sylvia was the one who had lured her husband's attention in the most shocking way and didn't want her son falling into the same trap. However, Charles didn't respond, hoping his father would recover soon. He had other things that were his worries. But over time, his silence changed. He began to notice things about Sylvia, like how she worked quietly, never complained, and never joined office gossip. When she wasn't typing or scheduling meetings, she was always studying. Curious and unable to resist the urge to ask, he asked one day what she was working on, and she told him she was completing her part-time university degree. That answer surprised him, and the more he learned about her, the more he found himself distracted. Charles tried to ignore it and told himself it was nothing, but he couldn't help noticing her more. He told himself it was wrong and that he shouldn't be drawn to her, but he was. Every short conversation and every accidental eye contact pulled him deeper. Sylvia was so stunning and intelligent that he could not help but notice. Then one afternoon, he found out from one of the older staff, who was a cleaner, that Sylvia was the woman who had saved his father's life by chance when she casually mentioned her, being a very graceful and kind lady. And that night, he couldn't sleep because the thought kept running through his mind that she was the reason his dad was alive. It made him angry and grateful at the same time. He was angry because he didn't know how to feel. However, the next day, during a meeting, one of the senior managers, who had been eyeing Sylvia, snapped at her with irritation. "Can you even read this figure properly? Or did someone put you here out of pity?" Sylvia's face flushed instantly, and she murmured an apology. Before she could say another word, Charles's voice cut through the room, calm, cold, and sharp. "That's enough, Mr. Adebayo. I assigned her that report, and it's correct. You're the one who misread the file." The room went silent, and Sylvia froze on the spot, stunned. For the first time, someone had stood up for her, and not just anyone, but the man everyone feared. After that day, things quietly began to change, and he started calling her into his office more often. At first, for work-related issues, but gradually, it became more. He would ask her to follow him to accompany him on site visits, which he initially excluded her from. At first, she thought he only trusted her efficiency, but then she began to notice the small things. How his eyes lingered on her longer than they should, how his voice softened when he spoke to her, how he sometimes asked if she had eaten or if she needed to rest. Days turned into weeks, and things began to shift between them. Sometimes they had lunch together after corporate meetings that required them to be out of the office, and though she tried to keep things professional, there was always a strange tension in the air, especially whenever she noticed that he was staring at her. He also began introducing her as my executive assistant, instead of the secretary. And wherever he went, Sylvia followed. Soon, they began to gossip about her again. "She's done it again," one of them muttered in the break room. First the father, now the son. That girl must be something else. Another laughed softly. They said Chief bought her a house. Maybe now she'll get an estate. The gossip spread like wildfire, and Sylvia heard it, of course. Every whispered word burned, but she stayed silent, reminding herself that defending one's dignity with words only fuels lies. Yet deep inside, she feared that it was the same way people judged her in a way that had once almost broken her when she was poor. One afternoon, as Sylvia sat in her office going through her files, Charles walked in without knocking, with his face darker, and his tone colder than usual. "I heard what they're saying about us," he said, his voice low but filled with anger. She froze, hearing his voice, as she whispered, forgetting to stand up. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he replied, stepping closer, his presence commanding the air between them. "Because I know the truth," he added. For a brief, dangerous moment, their eyes met, as the air between them charged with a tension that made her heartbeat quicken. Then he said quietly, "Let them talk. I decide what happens here." He turned and walked out, leaving her breathless. She also hated that he was too attractive for her heart not to be stirred. A few weeks later, Charles had to travel for a meeting abroad, and Sylvia went with him as his secretary. Everything went smoothly, and by the next day, their work was done. However, he suggested waiting for one more day, and subsequently told her that they should go to the beach together when he went to see her in her room. Sylvia wanted to refuse because she always avoided anything that could be misread, but she had no choice as his secretary and had to come along. The breeze was soft, and the sea stretched endlessly. Sylvia realized that it was the first time she had taken a break in 2 years, and for the first time in months, she felt free. He started teasing her, splashing water like a child, and she warned him to stop, laughing despite herself. Then she ran, and he chased after her. She was faster than he expected, laughing as she dodged him. But suddenly, she missed her step. Before she could steady herself, she tripped right into him. He caught her, but his balance slipped too, and they both fell onto the sand, his back hitting the ground with her on top of him. For a moment, everything stopped, and the sound of the waves faded. Their faces got too close. And her breath caught, his hand still holding her waist, their eyes locked. There was almost a kiss, almost. But she quickly pulled away, brushing the sand off her clothes, her heart pounding. "I told you this was a bad idea," she muttered. Charles sat up slowly, still catching his breath. "Maybe," he said quietly, but it didn't feel bad. Sylvia turned away, her heart pounding too fast, and Charles smiled faintly. He wanted to say something about how he felt at that moment, but he couldn't find the right words. He was the kind of man who always had control, yet around her, it was like that control kept slipping away. As they walked back toward the car, silence followed them. Sylvia tried to focus on the sea, on the soft sound of waves kissing the shore, but inside, she was terrified. She had felt something when she fell on him, which was something she shouldn't. He was her boss, and worse, was the son of the man who had saved her from poverty. Falling for him would be foolish, dangerous even. That night, in her room, she couldn't sleep. She replayed the moment again and again, telling herself it was just an accident, that it meant nothing. But her heart refused to listen. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, and the look in his eyes like he had been holding back too. Also, Charles lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling. He'd had his share of relationships, but this was different. There was something about Sylvia that disarmed him, and he couldn't stop thinking about her. Over the next few weeks, things between them became different. They were still professional, but there were moments where the glances, pauses, unspoken feelings, and tiny sparks refused to die. Whenever she entered a room, his heartbeat shifted, and whenever he looked at her, she quickly turned away, pretending to be busy. However, one morning at the office, Sylvia stood by his desk, holding a few documents for him to sign, and was explaining the schedule for the next board meeting when the doors suddenly burst open. Standing there was Mrs. Ajibade Fadik, looking so elegant and imposing. She was also burning with fury. Her eyes darted between her son and Sylvia, her expression darkening. "So it's true," she said coldly. "You've allowed that woman to sit in front of you every day and get to you like she did to your father." Charles clenched his jaw as he rose to feet, saying quietly that it was enough, but his mother turned sharply to him, disbelief flashing in her eyes. She reminded him of his position, his social class, and the embarrassment he was bringing upon their name. Then she stormed out, leaving behind a silence that pressed down on both of them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Sylvia's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. When she finally whispered an apology, Charles only shook his head and told her she had done nothing wrong. That night, when her phone rang, she already knew who it was. It was Fa de Kouaji Bieda, and she said she would give Sylvia one chance to leave quietly, without trouble. She also promised that if she stayed, she would make sure no door in the city ever opened for her again and make her penniless. The line went dead, and Sylvia sat still for a long time, staring at the shadows on her ceiling. The next morning, Sylvia walked into the office like nothing had happened even if people were talking, and yet beneath her calm, she was scared about her feelings and was confused about the right thing to do. Quitting, or hanging on. The distance between her and Charles had become more intense and filled with unspoken tension, accidental touches lingered too long, silences stretched, and glances that held feelings they didn't dare voice. However, one evening, when the rain lashed against the windows and the building was nearly empty, Sylvia stepped into Charles's office to drop off some documents and he stopped her from leaving after grabbing her hands, his eyes fixed on her like he had been holding something in for too long. He admitted helplessly he had been fighting what he felt, and that he had tried to stop thinking about her, but couldn't. Sylvia's heart thudded painfully as she told him he shouldn't say such things because people were already talking, and that his mother would never accept it. But he said he didn't care, his voice breaking slightly when he said it, and she saw something in him she hadn't seen before. His sincerity stripped of pride. Still, she told him not to make things harder, and that there were lines he couldn't cross. He took a slow step forward, eyes never leaving hers, and said some lines were worth crossing as he lifted her jaw. Almost leaning to kiss him, Sylvia's resolve cracked for just a heartbeat before she turned away and whispered goodnight without looking back. A week later, Vanessa arrived. She was Charles's elegant childhood friend, and the one everyone had always assumed he would marry. Her presence fit perfectly into the world Mrs. Ajibade had built, and she was the perfect match she wanted for her son. Vanessa moved through the company with ease, her smile poised, her voice dripping with polished arrogance, and she treated Sylvia with a kind of polite cruelty, while throwing compliments that belittled and subtly mocked her. Then one afternoon, she came to Sylvia's desk, placing a small velvet box on it, and told her she and Charles were getting engaged. Sylvia forced a smile and congratulated her, but as soon as Vanessa walked away, she packed up her things. That evening, her resignation letter sat on Charles's desk in his absence, her heart breaking quietly as she turned to leave. Charles searched everywhere for her after he figured out that she had left, and soon found out that she had moved out of Chief's apartment. She seemed to have changed her number, too, and she was nowhere to be found. It hurt his heart so deeply, and he was weak for days. His heart was so broken, and he could not just move on. He also cut all ties with Vanessa and told his mother to never bring up anything about their marriage again because he didn't love her. Weeks passed before they saw each other again, and it was because Chief Aji Bieda fell ill again. Sylvia couldn't stay away when she heard, and she went to the hospital quietly, hoping no one would see her, but Charles did. The moment he saw her standing by the doorway, everything in him seemed to stop. He asked why she left, and she told him the truth that the stares, whispers, and cruelty had become too heavy to bear. He said she had always been the only thing that made sense, and the only right thing in his life, and that he missed her so much and needed her. She told him that the engagement was a lie and that he was also done living for his mother's expectations. Sylvia froze, her mind racing as she told him not to say things like that, but he insisted. He said he was in love with her and that she had changed him. And then, as if summoned by fate, Mrs. Ogbada saw them and everywhere turned silent. She looked at her son, then at Sylvia, and for the first time, there was no anger in her eyes. She sighed, calling Charles stubborn like his father, then turned to Sylvia and said she couldn't keep hating the woman who saved her husband's life. She only asked that Sylvia never hurt her son. When she left, Sylvia could hardly speak. Charles took her hand gently, asking if he could finally say that he loved her, and Sylvia smiled faintly through tears, whispering that he already had. She also let out all the emotions she had been holding back so much and told him that she loved him so much, too. Months later, Sylvia graduated with honors, and Charles surprised her with a new car. They built their life together, and Sylvia soon became a partner with their company, rising faster than anyone ever saw coming. When they finally married 2 years later, his entire family stood proudly beside them, and Sylvia was glad to have a place to call home.